So I am Flavie Chalumeau-Boisgibaud, representative of the Events and Conferences Department of the Diplomatic Association of the Master DNS. And now I will briefly remind you the context in which we meet this morning. This event is the second of a series we have entitled The Indo-Pacific, Challenges and Opportunities for the West. Last week, we've already discussed the French, European, and American Indo-Pacific strategies. And this week, we will illustrate the economic cooperation between the EU and Singapore. The last event will take place next Thursday, and we will then wonder if the current American-Chinese competition can be described as a new Cold War. But for now, I will let the floor to my colleague Mathieu Levasseur, who will be the moderator of today's event. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Flavie, for this welcome. Est-ce que déjà vous m'entendez bien? Do you hear me correctly and do you see me correctly? All right, perfect. So thank you, Flavie, for these welcoming words. Last week's conference was very interesting. We learned a lot, and we hope this one will be as successful. So my name is Mathieu, and I am a student conducting a research project on the economic cooperation between the EU and Singapore. It was really important for us to organize this conference because not only is the topic very interesting and topical, but it is also a continuation of the previous conference. So I am sure that it's going to be really interesting and that we are going to learn a lot. And as a speaker today, we have the pleasure to welcome Mr. MEERLEER SANCHEZ, Trade Policy Officer at the EU delegation to Singapore. So this conference will highlight his analysis of this cooperation. And because we don't often have the opportunity to welcome a European diplomat, a Q&A session is organized at the end of the presentation, during which you will be able to ask Mr. MEERLEER SANCHEZ various questions. But before giving the floor to Mr. MEERLEER SANCHEZ, I will make a brief presentation of Singapore, of its economy, for those who are not familiar with the city-state. So here illustrates the position of Singapore. On the world map, we see that Singapore is a city-state at the extreme south of the Malay Peninsula. Here we are facing Southeast Asia. We begin to see the city-state better. And also we notice that Singapore is surrounded by 9 countries. These 10 countries constitute the ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asia Nations, which is a major economic bloc in the world. But I won't develop this slide because I know that Jean-Pierre has a slide reserved for ASEAN and I will let him develop it. Here, we have the zoom of the entire city-state. So to give some general information about the city-state, this is a really small area of mere 720 square kilometers with a population of 5,700,000. This implies a density of 8 people per square kilometer. I put the Human Development Index, but what we have to remember is that in 2019, Singapore had the 12th highest Human Development Index in the world. Singapore has a really important geographical position. Singapore is bordered by 2 important maritime straits, the Johor Strait and the Singapore Strait. And it is notably thanks to such a geographical position that Singapore has been able to develop very quickly, transforming into an essential world trade hub, as well as the second most important international port after Shanghai. And I put the last information. Singapore's GDP in 2018, so pre-pandemic, was $361 billion US, which ranked Singapore with the 36th highest GDP in the world. So here I display for you the evolution of Singapore's GDP per capita, and this is really that GDP per capita, which is very interesting because for years it has been one of the highest in the world. And we can observe that post-independence from Malaysia in 1965, Singapore's GDP per capita has strongly increased until 1997, when the Asian economic crisis has strongly impacted the city-state. In 2001, the stock market crash has hindered once again Singapore's rapidly developing economy. However, following these two crises, we can see that the GDP per capita again increased and the economy became further stronger to the point of resistance of 2008 crisis. And what I want to show you through this graph is that Singapore's economy is really strong and really resilient. When a crisis occurs, their impacts upon the Singapore's economy are slight and short-lived. And in fact, sometime later, the GDP increases quickly. And such an affirmation is confirmed by this slide, which shows that following the coronavirus, the GDP per capita returned to a level nearly equal to that of pre-pandemic rates. So we can observe, according to IMF forecast, that the GDP per capita of Singapore will continue to greatly increase. And I will share you the PowerPoint, and I put all the link, of course, under the slide, so you will be able to see the exact numbers. And what I want to show you with those both slides is that really Singapore has a resilient economy and a really strong economy. But a question which is quite important: upon what is Singapore's economy based? So first, we can see at the first sight that more than 30% of the added value in 2020 is only due to services, which is really important for Singapore. And in those services, we have, of course, wholesale trade. This is not surprising because the economic model of Singapore is based upon a strong openness to international trade, with the busiest port, for example. Also, we have finance and insurance. Singapore is the home of more than 200 banks, and it is a regional hub for numerous global financial services firms. And finally, we have manufacturing. So manufacturing is really important for Singapore. Singapore is a really industrialized economy, and the government ensures that manufacturing accounts for 20% of the country's GDP. And we can add like some other sectors like information and communication, which are important, but also before the coronavirus, for example, tourism. But now tourism is really limited because of coronavirus. Here, we can note the index of economic freedom, 2022, very recently. We can see that Singapore's economy is the freest economy in 2022. Why? We can explain that because Singapore provides a remarkably open and corruption-free business environment with prudent monetary fiscal policies and a transparent legal framework. Also, freedom of trade is viable and robust. And in addition, well-guaranteed property rights effectively encourage entrepreneurship and innovation. The general rule of law is also underpinned by a high degree of government transparency and accountability. And it explains why Singapore is the freest economy in 2022. And it is not the first time, it was also the case in 2017. And moreover, Singapore is the world's second most pro-business regime. Singapore has a unique position according to Doing Business 2022 from the World Bank. Singapore has a unique position in the global economy and plays a central role as a business epicenter in the heart of Asia. Singapore was consistently acknowledged as a global business hub. And we can explain that for the same reason that we said before, that Singapore has developed infrastructures, the world's busiest port, political stability, business policies, a skilled workforce, the use of English as a main working language, really important, and of course, respect of IPRs, as we said before. So if we combine all this slide and all that I have said before, we can sum up by saying that Singapore is a major financial hub in the Asia-Pacific region. Singapore has long earned a reputation as one of the world's most advanced economies. Despite its small domestic market and a lack of natural resources, Singapore successfully weathered through the financial crisis of 1997, 21, 2008, and 2020. Singapore's economy is also one of the most stable in the world, with no foreign debt since 1995, high government revenues, and a consistently positive surplus. So I will finish by saying that Singapore is and will continue to be a major economic partner for various countries across the region, but not only. Singapore, which continues to attract Western attention, particularly from the European Union. But I'm going to stop there, and I will give the floor to Mr. MEERLEER SANCHEZ, Trade Policy Officer at the EU delegation to Singapore. So, sir, you can present us your presentation. Feel free to take the floor to introduce yourself. We are listening to you, and normally you have the possibility to project your PowerPoint. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mathieu, for the introduction. And thank you very much for the organizers of this event. It's a great initiative to see that, let's say, from Europe, you're following closely the EU strategy on the Indo-Pacific, and in particular, have an interest on studying the case of Singapore. So I will give you today a presentation of EU-Singapore economic relations, and also with a view of our forward-looking cooperation. So as Mathieu mentioned, I will share a PowerPoint presentation. Obviously, it's an idea, let's say, to have a kind of, let's say, discussion with you as well, that we can have an interactive session. So please feel free to either post your questions in the chat box, or we can take questions after the presentation as well. So my name is Jean-Pierre Sanchez, and as Mathieu mentioned, I work for the EU delegation in Singapore as a trade policy officer. So I will give first a bit of introductory remarks on the EU delegation work and, let's say, the EU-Singapore relations as a whole. So obviously, as you know, the European Commission has an important role when it comes to trade, since it has an exclusive competence over trade policy. This means that only the EU can negotiate with third countries free trade agreements. So for instance, a bilateral country or a bilateral deal would not be possible if, to say so, France would want to negotiate a free trade agreement with Singapore. It would not be possible. It would only be under the EU umbrella. Then the EU delegation as such, so we have, as European Union, different offices around the globe, as well in Singapore. And so I represent, let's say, together with my colleagues, the DG Trade, which is the Directorate General for Trade of the European Commission in our office in Singapore. So as Mathieu already mentioned, let's say, Singapore is obviously a key partner of the EU in Southeast Asia. It is by far the largest trade and investment partner. We have very strong bilateral and regional ties. So as Mathieu mentioned, obviously, the relationship with Singapore, we cannot only see it bilaterally, but obviously we have a framework of cooperation with ASEAN. So as EU, obviously, we have always supported regional integration in other countries and regions. So that's why as well, we have a strong partnership with ASEAN. And Singapore has always played a key part in fostering that relationship, as it always has been also, let's say, a mentor and, let's say, a constructive partner in those relationships. We have a very strong presence of companies and businesses in Singapore. Approximately over 10,000 companies have actually an office in Singapore, either for bilateral trade relationships, but also as a hub, because Singapore is obviously a main trade, transport, and financial hub, logistical hub. So that is why a lot of companies decide to open, let's say, or have a presence, a commercial presence in Singapore to serve either ASEAN, Southeast Asia, or even the wider Asia Pacific. I will show you some investment and trade figures. So we have a kind of notion of why Singapore is such an important trade partner. And actually, we have, when it comes to trading goods, obviously, we're about almost 50 billion euros in trade and services. It's even higher. which is also actually quite impressive because usually trading goods can be a bit higher, but with Singapore, trading services is actually more important than trading goods. And then our foreign direct investment stocks are also quite impressive. UFDI stocks in Singapore reached at the end of 2020 over 250 billion. And I will give you the perspective by comparing with other trade partners, because sometimes these figures might seem a bit abstract. So if you look at, and these are figures that are actually released only 1 week ago. So this is for at the end of 2020, the share of EU international trading services, and you can see that Singapore is actually among the main partners of the EU in Asia and actually globally as well. The same goes for when we look at, let's say, trades, both services and goods combined with ASEAN. So you will see that actually Singapore already accounts for about 35% of the whole EU-ASEAN trade, which is actually very impressive as well. I will share, obviously, or the organizers can share the slides with the participants so you can have a closer look at the figures later, but it's just for you to have a bit of flavor of why Singapore is so important for the EU. And then when it comes to FDI stocks, you will see as well that Singapore actually at the end of 2020 was the largest destination of EU foreign direct investment in Asia Pacific, even ahead of China. So this obviously just confirms the importance of our economic relationship that we have with Singapore. So that is why obviously it makes a lot of sense to start negotiating, let's say, a free trade agreement, in the sense that we actually have a lot at stake. We want to preserve, let's say, our market access with Singapore, and this is obviously was a very important enabler, let's say, in order to start negotiations. First of all, why do we negotiate free trade agreements? Let's say, obviously, we have a very big agenda, let's say, with our trading partners, mostly because we believe that open trade supports growth, economic growth, and obviously the creation of jobs. A lot of jobs in the EU depend directly or indirectly from international trade. So it obviously is linked to, let's say, economic growth as a whole, but also now that we are, let's say, in the economic recovery phase of COVID-19, it will be important to remain that open trade for the economic recovery. Free trade agreements are important because they create a kind of predictable framework. It's like a major framework for businesses to operate in. So they have, let's say, a legal certainty when doing, let's say, business with trade partners. Obviously, the classic part that we often talk about is market access in the terms of eliminating or reducing tariffs. That with Singapore, I will explain later, was maybe less of an issue, but it's definitely something very important when we want to open up protectionist markets where sometimes there are high tariffs on certain products that are of interest of our EU exporters. Then a second or third part is actually the removal of non-tariff barriers. So obviously these can be technical barriers to trade or certain obstacles that countries can impose in order to prevent imports. Obviously, it's very important that we create within an FTA a kind of framework to remove these barriers. So all this is obviously in the case of trading goods very important, but also improving market access for services or for government procurement is quite important. And often we include other trade-related rules within FTAs, let's say, that are obviously of interest of the EU. So you will see that we have incorporated, for instance, a lot of provisions on sustainability. This is not the case for other countries, but we make a very big deal about it, let's say, to include those provisions on trade and sustainable development. And obviously, we want to go beyond what we have achieved at WTO level. So, for instance, this can be the case on intellectual property rights. It can be the case on other, let's say, provisions. But it is also, let's say, an opportunity, let's say, to go beyond what we have already at WTO level. When we go, let's say, to the timelines of the EU-Singapore trade relationship when it comes to the negotiation of the FTA, we had a kind of difficult journey in the sense that you will see that the timeline obviously goes back for several years. At first, actually, the EU always has a view of, let's say, as I said before, encouraging regional integration in other parts of the world. And our interest was at first to have an EU-ASEAN agreement, because we do think that obviously that would help, first of all, the integration of the other region, because obviously, as you know, the more integrated you are, let's say you will go from a free trade area to a customs union, and a customs union obviously obliges you to have a common external tariff. And with that common external tariff, obviously it's needed that you can, or it implies that you can actually only have a trade agreement with the whole group of countries that you're representing. Unfortunately, let's say this was not possible, and after, let's say, a couple of rounds, let's say, of discussion, it was decided that we would go for a bilateral approach, and first with Singapore, since Singapore was maybe the easiest partner within ASEAN to progress. And so basically, the FTA negotiations per se were launched in December 2009. And then you can see, let's say, from the timeline, let's say, when the negotiations were, let's say, advancing. And then we had another, let's say, issue, which was in relation to investment, because we had included, let's say, by the time, an investment protection chapter. And it was still uncertain at that time if the EU would have, let's say, an exclusive competence over investment. So the Commission basically submitted to the European Court of Justice, let's say, the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement with the inclusion of the Investment Protection Agreement, to see if it was a non-exclusive competence agreement. Then in 2017, so we had to wait for a while for the ruling. It was actually quite favorable for the EU in the sense that it reconfirmed the exclusive competence of the trade policy agenda. However, there were certain parts of investment that would be still considered as mixed competence. And so it was decided that this agreement would be split into two. So there you will see that there we will talk now of two agreements, two separate agreements, the EU-Singapore FTA and the EU-Singapore Investment Protection Agreement. And so we signed the agreement in October 2018. Then we had to do our internal ratification process, which includes obviously the important consent by the European Parliament. This was given in 2019. And then in November 2019, we finally got the final approval by the Council for the entry into force of the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, which was then finally done on the 21st of November 2019. So this is about 2 years ago. Now, what happened to the EU-Singapore Investment Protection Agreement? So the fact that it has become, let's say, a mixed agreement, we also need to go through the ratification by all the EU member states. So this is currently in progress. So after the consent by the European Parliament, actually now 12 EU member states have already ratified this agreement, but we will still have to wait for the remaining 15 in order to get that agreement into force. So this can take a couple of years. But what is important for the FTA is that it has become, or it has come into force completely, as it is an exclusive competence agreement. And this is, for instance, different with CETA, so the Canada agreement, which is still under provisional application. So this might all sound very complicated. It might be as well. However, it's important for you to know that obviously, there are two tracks with Singapore. Maybe just on investment, the last word on that is that some member states have actually bilateral investment treaties that are dated from before, and those will remain into force until the EU-Singapore Investment Protection Agreement enters into force, and then it will be superseded by the EU agreement. So I will briefly explain, let's say, what we included in the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement. So as I mentioned before, we have comprehensive market access in the sense that we have full elimination of tariffs from the Singapore side from day one of the entry into force. The EU is still in the process of eliminating those tariffs. So we have at entry into force eliminated about 84% of tariffs. and now we're in the third year, so this is progressively moving on. Then in terms of services as well, we have increased market access, let's say, for services, which is very important, as I already mentioned. Government procurement, so this is a chapter that allows companies to participate in tenders. So there as well, we have improved market access for companies to bid for public contracts in Singapore and vice versa. Then we have enhanced rules for cooperation. So we have a chapter on customs. So customs is very important because obviously that's where all the clearance of goods goes. And there, obviously, we need a lot of cooperation between the customs authorities. But obviously, we have as well a lot of measures on trade facilitation, which is actually aimed at facilitating, let's say, the clearance of goods. You might have heard as well at WTO level that there is also an agreement on trade facilitation. So this is all, let's say, hand in hand, and we try to upgrade these provisions as well to adapt to the realities of trade. Then rules of origin. Rules of origin refer actually to identify in a way the nationality of the goods, so that we can ensure that trade preferences go to the goods that are originating in either the EU or Singapore. Then we have what I mentioned already, let's say a specific chapter on technical barriers to trade. And so there, for instance, we included an annex on trade in electronics, which is actually quite important for the EU-Singapore trade relationship. But the idea is to, let's say, remove burdensome, let's say, conformity assessments, for instance, that can let's say, be a hindrance to trading goods. We also have a chapter on sanitary and phytosanitary measures. So this is more linked to plant and animal products. When it comes to, for instance, products of animal origin, meat is a key component to preserve, let's say, that no barriers would be imposed unnecessary, let's say, to prevent the trade in food products. Then we have, obviously, in more innovative emerging areas, such as intellectual property rights. So these refer to copyrights, to trademarks, etc. And obviously there we had a specific interest, which was to include as well provisions on geographical indications. So for, I guess you're all very familiar in France, let's say specifically because you have a lot of GIs like champagne, which we obviously managed to include because Singapore does not have any GIs and they didn't have, let's say, an enhanced GI regime. So with the FTA into force, they actually improved their legislation when it comes to GI protection. They have now a proper GI functioning registry, and we have actually already protected about 140 GI names in Singapore. And obviously e-commerce linked to trade in services, obviously it's a very emerging area which is fast evolving and fast growing. Obviously at the time, let's say when the FTA was concluded, and now already almost 10 years have passed. So on that, we might need to revisit and, let's say, review some of these provisions. And then, as I said before, also a key part of the EU trade agreements are, let's say, the part on sustainable development. And so there we have specific provisions on environment. So basically, this is all related to environmental protection, let's say all the multilateral cooperation that we can have, and on labor rights. So this is very important as well for the EU to make that link, let's say, to protection of labor rights, and in particular to the fundamental ILO conventions, in view of, let's say, ensuring that labor rights are respected also in the territory of our trading partners. And then we also have a specific chapter on renewable energy generation. This was also quite innovative, and basically it prevents, let's say, the creation of barriers for, let's say, renewable energy. So then, as I mentioned before, the agreement finally came into force on the 21st of November 2019. So prior to the entry into force, we had already a lot of areas that would need to be implemented. As you know, let's say an FTA also comes with a lot of obligations. So Singapore had to review some of its legislation, let's say, when it comes to the preparation of the implementation of the FTA. And after the FTA came into force, we still have some provisions that need to come into force. And one of them is, for instance, border measures on counterfeited goods that will be implemented after 3 years of entry into force, etc. So just for you to know, for us from trade in the EU, obviously one part is important, which is the negotiation, but the second part, which is the actual implementation of all provisions, is a high priority as well, because we need to ensure as well that all our trading partners correctly implement, let's say, the provisions that we have in our trade agreements, so that businesses can tap into the benefits of those agreements. The free trade agreement, let's say, as well has a kind of institutional framework. So we have a kind of bodies that are created to ensure that implementation. We have an overviewing trade committee, which is, let's say, the major, let's say, dialogue institutional body of the trade agreement. And then we have specialized committees on, let's say, the specific chapters of the FTA. So there is one committee on trading goods, one on SPS, one on customs, and the other one on trading services, investment, and government procurement. Then we have a specific board on trade and sustainable development. And so this board basically reviews the commitments of the partners under the TSD chapter, but it also includes a dialogue with civil society, which is also very important for us, to include, let's say, domestic groups, we call them domestic advisory groups, to have a dialogue with both EU and Singapore government officials on the implementation of these TSD provisions. And then we have also now created a kind of intellectual property dialogue. This was a kind of committee that was missing. And so actually in December, we agreed that we will now set up a specific dialogue on intellectual property, because there are quite a lot of interesting, let's say, areas that we can further cooperate and discuss. So in general, let's say, as a European Commission, we do a lot of reporting as well to the member states and to the other institutions of the EU. So I would recommend you, for instance, to look at one of our key, let's say, publications, which are our annual reports that we send to the European Parliament and the Council on the implementation of our FTA. So there we have an overview of the key aspects of our implementation and enforcement when it comes to removal of trade barriers, when it comes to the monitoring of those specific FTA commitments, but as well looking at what I mentioned before, let's say, the utilization of, for instance, trade preferences. So these PUR, so preference utilization rates, to see of how many, let's say, percentage, for instance, of the trade has actually benefited in practice of those tariff eliminations. And sometimes the results can be surprising, either negative or positive, but it's important to monitor these, because this is also a key part of the FTA negotiations. Then we have, as the EU, a market access strategy, which is basically a partnership, let's say, to work towards the implementation of FTAs, either in Brussels or in, let's say, the countries where we have offices. So, for instance, in my case, let's say, since I work at the EU delegation, so we interact locally here in Singapore with EU member states embassies, so countries that are represented in Singapore, but also with EU businesses. And in the case of Singapore, I already mentioned there are quite a lot. So quite a lot of stakeholders that might as well provide us, let's say, some intelligence, market intelligence, or let's say they can come to us to maybe flag an issue that I have encountered when trading with Singapore, so we can take action if needed. And the same actually happens in Brussels, where from the European Commission, there will be, let's say, a continuous dialogue with EU member state representatives of the member states in Brussels, or EU businesses, associations that might request action for the Commission. And as you know, we have created a new, let's say, enforcement officer, let's say, at the EU level, which really looks at, let's say, the enforcement part of our free trade agreements. Then, let's say, when it comes to EU-Singapore economic, maybe forward-looking cooperation, obviously, you are aware of the Indo-Pacific strategy, which was a communication launched in September last year. Before that, maybe also good for you to know that we, as trade, as well have a specific trade policy strategy, which was communicated 1 year ago, which builds on open, assertive, sustainable strategic autonomy as well. So key, let's say, areas of the EU's interest that we see nowadays with third countries. And so the Indo-Pacific is obviously focused on one specific area of the world. Obviously, there is no reason to justify, as we all know, how important this part of the world is when it comes to the global economy. But there are many areas where we can cooperate beyond economy, and so there can be security, there can be connectivity, all kinds of areas. Obviously, when you look at the economic cooperation part, the trade part is very key, and obviously we are within the Indo-Pacific strategy very, let's say, motivated to work with other partners. So besides Singapore, we have an FTA in force with Vietnam, but we are currently also negotiating with Indonesia, and there are other trading partners as well, such as Thailand, the Philippines, and Malaysia within ASEAN, where we have, let's say, stepped up our talks in order to advance towards a free trade agreement. Beyond, let's say, the Southeast Asia within the Indo-Pacific as well. Obviously, we have already trade deals with Japan and South Korea, but obviously we look at all other partners that can be potential, like-minded in the case of open trade. When it comes to the enforcement of trade agreements, as I mentioned before, this is a key priority with Singapore. And then beyond that, we have obviously now within the economic recovery focused on 2 points, which is the green recovery, but also the digital recovery. And these 2 priorities of the Commission are also embedded within the Indo-Pacific strategy. And that is why we mentioned, for instance, the fact that with like-minded partners, we would look into possible digital partnerships. And Singapore is mentioned within the Indo-Pacific strategy clearly, together with Korea and Japan. We also mentioned that we would like to step up our cooperation for a green, let's say, partnership with like-minded countries. And we mentioned Singapore as well when it comes to the research part. You know that we have a huge research cooperation package with this Horizon Europe. And there as well, we have invited Singapore as well in a way to join, or we have started, let's say, preliminary discussions in view of a potential joining of Singapore as an associated country to Horizon Europe. So this is, let's say, where obviously we see Singapore as a key enabler in enforcing, let's say, the Indo-Pacific strategy and implementing this strategy concretely. In December last year, we actually had our first inaugural trade committee, which was chaired by Executive Vice President Dombrovskis and the Minister of Trade of Singapore. And basically there, beyond, let's say, the review of the implementation of our FTA, the EU and Singapore also agreed actually to strengthen the part on bilateral digital trades. And so this is actually a very important step because it allows now to launch, let's say, discussions at technical level to identify, let's say, where we can actually improve our digital partnership. And this can be through the upgrades of the chapter on services, where we have obviously provisions on e-commerce as well, but also to seek maybe other areas of cooperation for digital trades. And obviously, in parallel, we are at WTO level as well, talking a lot on e-commerce and trading services. So all this, you have to see it as a whole. But with Singapore, because Singapore is actually also part of the OTABA group, which is a group that has been created for the reform of the WTO. And so with Singapore, we have really a like-minded partner to see how we can build towards, let's say, greater cooperation for digital trade. And actually, earlier this week, so this was only on Monday, we released another statement, which was this time done by Commissioner Breton and the Minister of Singapore on the agreement to accelerate towards a comprehensive digital partnership. So maybe even beyond the trade part, looking at other areas, let's say, that obviously are transforming the whole digital spectrum. So we can have, talking about SMEs as well, how let's say they can benefit from digital trades and partnerships, but also technologies like 5G, artificial intelligence, all emerging areas where there is definitely a lot of scope for the EU and Singapore to cooperate, and also to see if we can build a better partnership, let's say, to step up our cooperation, basically. So all this is basically what we are doing now, let's say, with Singapore. So one, the implementation of our comprehensive trade agreement, and second, let's say, looking at this forward-looking cooperation where we can, let's say, reinforce our partnership in the digital area. And then on green and sustainability, obviously, it's very important that we keep also this dialogue. Within our FTA, we have this trade and sustainable development chapter, but also Singapore is a very, let's say, strong player when it comes now to the sustainability agenda and the green transformation of the economy, when it comes to green energy, but also the whole economy transformation. So it's very important that we work, obviously, with like-minded countries, and we see that there is a lot of potential there. Our companies are definitely interested and are already, let's say, tied with Singapore, but also with the view of our cooperation with ASEAN. This is a very good example, and we always refer to Singapore as a kind of pathfinder in a way to increase our cooperation with the rest of the region. So with that, I will stop the presentation, but I'm very happy to take questions and to discuss with you. I'm sure you might have some questions or comments. Feel free to share.
So thank you, Sir, for this very interesting, complete, and original intervention. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, this is the time to ask them. Do not hesitate. You can say them orally or write them in the chat. It's as you want. Vas-y, Flavie, let's go.
Thank you, Mathieu. Thank you for your presentation, and also obviously yours, Mr. MEERLEER SANCHEZ. It was very interesting and very detailed, and I've learned a lot thanks to you. So thank you. My question is the following. Actually, you already started to answer it, but do you see some fields in which the EU-Singapore cooperation could be either enhanced or started, some fields in which there is no cooperation for the moment, but you who are on the ground, if I may tell this, do you see fields like this where there could be cooperation and there is not for the moment? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that question. Actually, with Singapore, we are able to discuss quite a lot of issues, not only because we have different frameworks. So we actually also have a partnership and cooperation agreement, which is also an agreement that has quite a lot of areas of dialogue. Maybe it's more focused on the political security dialogue as well, but it's also, let's say, an agreement that provides this kind of framework to have dialogues on many policy areas. Obviously, I didn't mention all of the policy areas that we are cooperating with Singapore. For instance, we have a very important transport relationship as well. And within that framework, for instance, we have concluded last year the first region-to-region transport agreement, which is CATA, which is a comprehensive air transport agreement. And so this is obviously an area where there is a lot of scope as well for further cooperation. We have worked on climate change, on circular economy, which obviously are very linked to the sustainability agenda. So actually, we're quite happy with our dialogue, and Singapore is very open to share best practices, to cooperate in many areas. So in that sense, we have not, let's say, excluded any kind of, let's say, area. On the contrary, we're very keen on continuing our excellent relationships and basically deepen them as much as we can.
Thank you.
All right, so if anyone has another question, I will ask a question. So we know that the free trade agreement entered into force in November 2019, a few weeks before coronavirus. And I wanted to ask you, what was the outlook of the cooperation in November 2019? Would we have seen an exponential growth in imports, exports, or services if coronavirus did not existed?
Yes, I mean, that's obviously a very difficult question to answer. I mean, what would have happened with the world without the pandemic? I think obviously the pandemic has also provided us new areas that maybe we would not be looking at today. And for instance, when it comes to cooperation on health, also Singapore was one of the first countries in Asia to connect to the EU digital certificate, let's say for the COVID-19, which allows actually travel or let's say vaccination certificates to be recognized between Singapore and the EU. And all this, let's say, for instance, is interesting because, you know, the dialogue on data privacy and it was part of that. So, yeah, I mean, obviously we were seeing, let's say, at the end of 2019 that our trade was growing. 2020 was a very bad year. I mean, economically over the whole world, but our exports and imports, fell dramatically. Obviously, because there were a lot of areas that are linked to the pandemic, such as transport, such as tourism. But also we have seen now a recovery, and actually 2 days ago we saw the first figures for the first estimates for 2021, where we saw that actually our exports are again growing to Singapore. So yeah, we will have to see how it evolves, but obviously we are quite optimistic that the worst has passed and that we can now, let's say, build together for recovery. But it's true, we have lost a bit of momentum, let's say, of economic growth, but yeah, it will come back. And I see a question in the chat, so I might take it already. So the question is, economic growth and development of Singapore has been great, but what are the challenges to future growth? Because it is limited in space, for example. Okay, that's very relevant. Obviously, Singapore is geographically limited. It does not have natural resources. So they have been obviously clever in a way of building their economic growth, let's say, when it comes to investing a lot in innovation, in research, in emerging areas. So they're definitely also very open when it comes to trade, and this obviously has helped them to become the hub that they are today, to be such a logistical, let's say, hub when it comes for maritime trade, but also transport in general. So I think it's definitely a different strategy than other countries where natural resources are such an important part of the economy. So I cannot speak for Singapore, obviously, but obviously we have seen that they're very forward-looking. They have a very transparent system in place, no corruption, and so that makes them, with a lot of planning ahead. So they have basically turned over their maybe limited capacities into an opportunity to seek, let's say, major economic growth. So I think we have actually also a lot to learn from Singapore in how they managed, let's say, to become such an Asian tiger, economic tiger in such a few decades, yeah, becoming a real industrialized developed country. And then I see another question. How can the EU and ASEAN further cooperate within the digital domain to ensure economic competitiveness during an increasingly digital era? So also, again, talking about digital issues, obviously within ASEAN, there is, let's say, a huge difference between the member states. So not all ASEAN members are as developed as Singapore, which also makes it sometimes maybe different or difficult for Singapore to find, let's say, the same kind of standard setting that they would want to seek. So obviously we are always willing to cooperate, deepen our relationships with ASEAN as a whole, but it will also always depend on the ASEANs themselves in the sense that also they have to agree internally on how they will proceed on certain areas. As you know, ASEAN, when it comes to trade, has been very important in ensuring RCEP. So RCEP is this major trade deal that has come into force earlier this year. But let's say on digital, maybe there is still scope for them to yeah, increase their cooperation among themselves. But in the end, I think all the economies, we will have to adapt, let's say, whether we like it or not. It's also a lesson of the pandemic to a digital, let's say, advanced economic, let's say, framework, as there is no turning back. And this is a very fast evolving domain. So we all have to catch up if we're late. Otherwise, we will try to be the standard setters and try to be on top of our game. And I know in the EU, this is one of the exercises that we're also doing, let's say, to step up our internal efforts, let's say, to be as digital advanced as we can be. I know it's still very early, but if you have any questions, please feel free to post them.
Maybe another question, not clearly related to the content of your intervention, but more on your career as you are a trade officer for an EU delegation. It's a quite unusual job. So I wondered if you could tell us more about your job, about how you came to this position, given that most of us are students. We're very interested in such a career path.
Yes, definitely, and I think obviously all of you within, let's say, this area of research, you all have the right profile as well to consider or to think to work for the institutions. I do think it's a very interesting, let's say, kind of job. I will post, let's say, in the chat the link to the official website, let's say, where you can read more about career developments for, let's say, for students like you who are interested in considering that path for the future. Obviously, within, let's say, the delegations, maybe there is less staff employed than, let's say, in headquarters, so be it in Brussels, in Luxembourg, in Strasbourg, if you want to work for the parliament. Yeah, I would just encourage you to look into it. There are always opportunities as well if you are interested in first doing an internship. I did myself an internship before I started working for the EU institution. So this is always a good way of also understanding better how in practice it works. So you can do internships in headquarters at the Commission, you can do internships for the Parliament or directly for EU delegations. So be on the lookout as well for those. If you're interested, you can always apply. And then indeed, let's say for then a professional career itself, yeah, I mean, it depends on the domain you want to do, but if it's related to trade, I think obviously it's very interesting to work for the EU, as I mentioned, obviously you represent the whole EU, and on trade there is a lot, let's say, to deal with, but it can be in many other areas where you see that the EU has an important role. So yeah, I mean, it's a process, let's say, to develop every career. I think I would encourage you always to try. It's not always easy because there are a lot of people who are trying at the same time, but that should not discourage you. On the contrary, I think everybody can make it. So it's definitely something to look into. So yeah, if you have any specific or practical question, I'm happy to take it as well on possible careers to work for the EU.
For me, I have a question, but it was about the presentation. We know that Europe used to negotiate, or is supposed to negotiate, a free trade agreement only with countries that share the same standards. However, Singapore, but especially the other ASEAN countries, have some problem with human rights, for example. So the question is there a change of policy from the EU, which realized that if it negotiated with countries that have the same standard, the EU will negotiate alone?
Yes, that's a very good question. So obviously, we do, let's say, take into account, let's say, the status of democracy, the status of human rights, while negotiating with the country. Obviously, no country is perfect, and I think even in the EU, we also have our struggles sometimes. However, it is always important, let's say, that we kind of achieve to have at least a dialogue with a partner rather than isolating in that country that might not have the same effect. So if we achieve at least to have a partnership where we can tackle those issues and discuss them, we might be actually closer to reaching our goal rather than doing the opposite and turning our back and just going somewhere else. So with the agreements that we have on trades, as I mentioned, we have this, for instance, clauses on human rights. We have the possibility to basically suspend a trade deal if there is a gross violation of human rights. But also we look at labor rights, and I mentioned specifically with Singapore, the fundamental ILO convention. So Singapore still needs to ratify 3 fundamental ILO conventions. So this is something that we're closely looking at, is part of the FTA. We had a similar issue with Korea, which has now been solved. With Vietnam as well, let's say this was a very important part, let's say, of the ratification process as well, because it's an issue that is closely monitored by the European Parliament and also by the member states, by civil society as a whole. So yes, I mean, it is obviously not because we talk trade and business that we do not talk sustainability issues, and we have always been very key in making sure that our trade partners do not lower standards so that it does not become a race to the bottom exercise in order to increase trade. You know, on the contrary, sustainability is really at core. And so that's why we try to have as much dialogue with our partners to make them as well believe that this is actually in their interests. And so I think actually Singapore, for instance, also on the green economy, they have made a lot of transformation in the last years, from maybe being lesser committed to sustainability and the green economy. Now they see it actually as an opportunity, an economic opportunity to be a forefront runner when it comes to the green energy transformation. So this is something where we can actually help our partners in as well raising the standards. We have our Green Deal, which has been followed up very closely by the trade partners in Asia, Singapore, but other ASEAN countries as well. So this is definitely an area that we want to share best practices and cooperate as much as we can. I see another question. Should the EU be considered as an institutional model for ASEAN? What are the fundamental challenges of this approach moving forward? Okay, when comparing regional integration in the world, obviously, often people look at the EU as a reference. We have to take into account, obviously, that the EU integration process is obviously very, let's say, geographically different, historically different, geopolitically different to other regions. So you cannot just copy-paste a mechanism and then implement it in another region of the world. And I think ASEAN has made for themselves a kind of model which is often referred to as the ASEAN way, which is different from the EU, which is more intergovernmental. They take decisions by consensus. So all of them have to agree, but they also take into account the different kind of levels of, for instance, their economies. So we have, let's say, larger economies, but you also have less developed economies such as Cambodia. However, for instance, when it comes to human rights, there as well, there can be issues, such as now is the case with Myanmar. We obviously have always been very keen at showing ASEAN or the Southeast Asian countries that we think that enhanced regional integration is beneficial for them. I think they are also convinced of that. Obviously, it is not always easy to build, let's say, integration based on a consensus system like in ASEAN. However, we are open, let's say, to always increase our dialogue to basically show our experiences. I mean, I think it's difficult for the ASEANs to maybe accept such an institutional model because we obviously have a very big bureaucracy. ASEAN has a very light institutional model with only an ASEAN secretariat in Jakarta. So I don't think they will evolve towards such an institutional model like having a European Parliament and these kind of things. This has happened in other countries, especially in Latin America. I think they have followed more the EU model for integration. But in ASEAN, they're not really looking into that. And that's fine. I mean, obviously, I think we have to obviously allow them to think their own, let's say, ways ahead for increasing their regional integration based on their sensitivities, their realities. And obviously, that's we're happy to cooperate as much as we can with them.
All right, so we are going to wait if we have other questions. But if no one has another question, I think that we are going to end the session. All right. So it seems like this was the last question. So thank you all for coming. We hope that you were really interested. It was a real pleasure to organize that conference. Thank you, Mr. MEERLEER-SANCHEZ, for speaking, for intervening. It was really relevant, really enriching. We learned a lot of things. We hope you had a pleasant time with us. Normally, photos of the conference will be posted on the social networks of our association. And for those who were absent, the conference was recorded. So do not hesitate to transmit them. So yeah, thank you everyone, and I wish you a pleasant day to everyone and a pleasant evening for you, Mr. MEERLEER-SANCHEZ, because it's 5 p.m. in Singapore. So yeah, have a pleasant evening.
Thank you very much, Mathieu, and all the colleagues for assisting today, and I wish you the best for your future, and hopefully we will meet again somewhere.
Yeah, thank you very much. Or goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Et pour ceux qui sont intéressés, n'oubliez pas notre conférence la semaine prochaine sur la question de savoir si la compétition entre Chine et États-Unis peut être considérée comme une nouvelle guerre froide. Elle aura lieu jeudi prochain à 18h30. So, thank you again, Mr. MEERLEER-SANCHEZ, and have a good day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.